There is a version of Michael Jackson's story that the world thinks it knows. The glove, the moonwalk, the shrieking fans, the records that couldn't be broken, the headlines that couldn't be ignored. But underneath all of that, underneath the spectacle and the mythology and the carefully constructed image, there is another story. A quieter one, a darker one, one that was happening in real time while the world was looking somewhere else. And when you hear this version, when you understand the moments that actually changed Michael Jackson, not the ones that made the news, but the ones that happened in private rooms, in quiet conversations, in the spaces between the performances, you will never see him the same way again. Because the man the world called the King of Pop was carrying something so heavy, for so long, that the only miracle is not that he broke. The miracle is that he lasted as long as he did. It starts before the fame, before the sold-out shows, before the name Michael Jackson meant anything to anyone outside a small house on Jackson Street in Gary, Indiana. It starts with a boy who could feel music before he could fully understand language, who watched his older brothers rehearse and absorbed everything, instinctively, the way a sponge absorbs water without being told to. Michael was different from the beginning and everyone around him knew it. Not different in the way that gets celebrated immediately. Different in the way that makes adults uncomfortable. Too sensitive, too observant, too emotionally present in a world that preferred children to be seen and not felt. And his father Joseph, a man built from steel and silence and the particular kind of ambition that grows in people who believe the world has underestimated them, saw in Michael's difference not a child to be protected, but a gift to be deployed. The rehearsals began when Michael was barely old enough to hold the memory of them. Joseph Jackson has been described by his own children in terms that range from disciplinarian to something far more disturbing. The belt was real, the fear was real, the message delivered through years of rehearsal under threat of punishment was real. And that message was simple and devastating: perfection is the minimum. Anything less is failure. Anything less has consequences. And Michael, who was by nature a perfectionist already, absorbed that standard and then internalized it so completely, that he stopped needing his father to enforce it. He became his own enforcer, his own harshest critic, his own most relentless taskmaster. And that internal voice, that never satisfied, always pushing, impossibly demanding voice, never went quiet. Not at the time Michael was 11 years old and his Jackson 5 were signed to Motown Records. Not ever. The machinery of the music industry had already begun doing what it always does to young talent. Consuming it. Motown styled them, packaged them, controlled their image with a precision that left almost no room for individual expression. Diana Ross was presented as the woman who discovered them, a marketing decision, not a biographical truth. And the Jackson boys were taught, implicitly and explicitly, that the story being told about them mattered more than the story that was actually true. That lesson, the lesson that image supersedes reality, that what people believe about you is more powerful than what you actually are, settled into Michael's consciousness like a stone settling into deep water. Slowly, permanently, and it shaped everything that came after. The transition from Motown to Epic Records in 1975 was a turning point that doesn't get enough attention. Because it wasn't just a business decision. It wasn't just about royalty rates and creative control, though both of those things were factors. It was the moment Michael Jackson began to understand that he had agency. That he was not simply a product to be managed, but a force that could direct its own movement. The family's departure from Motown was controversial. Jermaine stayed behind, married to the label founder's daughter, and the fracture in the family that created, the quiet, complicated grief of it, was something Michael carried in a way he rarely discussed publicly. Because Michael loved deeply, fully, perhaps too fully for a world that couldn't always love him back in equal measure. And every loss of connection, every fracture in the circle of people he trusted, left a mark that didn't fade. But nothing in those early years prepared him for what was coming. Because in 1979, Michael Jackson released Off the Wall, produced by Quincy Jones, and something shifted, not just commercially, though the album sold 20 million copies and spawned 4 top 10 singles. Something shifted in Michael himself. For the first time, he could hear on a recording what he had always heard in his head. The gap between his imagination and the reality of what technology could capture was closing. And that closing gap, that sense of finally being able to translate the music he felt into the music the world could hear, created in him an appetite for perfection that became almost impossible to contain. Off the Wall was extraordinary, and the Grammy Awards gave it almost nothing. One Grammy for Best R&B Vocal Performance. And Michael Jackson sat with the disconnect between what he knew he had made and what the industry had chosen to acknowledge, and made a private decision. He would make something they could not ignore, something that would make ignoring him literally impossible. That something was Thriller. And the story of how Thriller was made is a story about obsession that borders on something beyond dedication. The sessions with Quincy Jones were legendary for their intensity. Michael arrived knowing exactly what he wanted and simultaneously open to anything that could make it better. He listened to every suggestion. He fought for every instinct. He recorded vocal takes that were already perfect, and then recorded them again and again, chasing a version that existed somewhere slightly beyond what anyone else could even hear. The budget exceeded what Epic Records had authorized. The timeline extended past what the schedule allowed. And Quincy Jones, who had seen extraordinary talent in his long career, later described working with Michael during this period as watching someone in communication with something larger than themselves. As if Michael wasn't composing music so much as receiving it, and then refusing to release it until every element matched what had been received. Thriller was released on November 30, 1982. And what followed belongs less to the category of music history and more to the category of cultural events that reorder the world. The album didn't just sell, it became a permanent fixture of human experience in a way that almost no creative work ever achieves. But here's what changed Michael Jackson during the Thriller era, and this is the part that almost never gets discussed. The success created a kind of isolation that was genuinely new. Because when you become the most famous person on earth, and you are still, underneath all of it, a deeply sensitive human being who grew up without the tools to process extreme emotion in healthy ways, the success itself becomes a kind of trap. Everyone wants something from you. Everyone needs something from you. And the ability to distinguish between people who see you and people who see what you represent becomes nearly impossible. Michael began retreating, not from performance. Never from performance, but from the ordinary texture of human life. From casual moments. From the kind of unguarded connection that most people experience without thinking about it. And this is where things take a disturbing turn. Because the retreat from ordinary life, the construction of Neverland, the increasingly unconventional ways Michael tried to recapture something of what had been taken from him in childhood, were not symptoms of strangeness. They were symptoms of grief. Profound, unprocessed, decades-old grief for a childhood that had been consumed by an industry before he was old enough to protect it. The amusement park rides at Neverland weren't eccentricities. They were attempts at repair. The menagerie of animals, the movie theater, the carnival, these were the building blocks of an experience Michael had seen other children have and had watched from the outside, from behind the barrier of his own extraordinary talent, never able to simply enter. And now, with all the money in the world, he was trying to build a door. But no one expected what was happening simultaneously behind the scenes. Because even as Neverland was being constructed as a paradise, Michael's body was beginning to tell a different story. The 1984 Pepsi commercial accident, where pyrotechnics misfired and his scalp was set ablaze on camera, in front of a live audience, caused second- and third-degree burns that required surgery and introduced Michael to a level of physical pain he had never experienced before. The treatment involved prescription medications. And those medications offered something that Michael, with his history of anxiety and emotional overload, found almost unbearably appealing. Not just pain relief, but quiet, the quiet inside his own nervous system that he had almost never known. That discovery, that medications could create the internal silence that fame and performance and the weight of global expectation had never allowed, was the beginning of a relationship with prescription drugs that would define and ultimately end his life. What happened next shocked everyone who was paying close attention. Because the mid-1980s brought not just professional triumph but personal transformation at a pace and scale that the public couldn't fully process. The physical changes were accelerating. Vitiligo, a condition Michael himself identified as the cause of his skin's changing pigmentation, was real and documented. But the surgical changes were also real. And the combination of the two, the genuine medical condition layered over the chosen modifications, created a face that the media could not resist turning into a symbol. A symbol of instability, of obsession, of a man who had lost his grip on reality. But what the symbol obscured was the reality underneath it. A man who had been performing for an audience since he was 5 years old. Who had never had a single day where his physical appearance was not subject to public evaluation. Who had grown up hearing his father mock the shape of his nose in front of other people. And who, with the resources of the most successful entertainer in history, finally had the ability to change the things he had always been told were wrong with him. That context doesn't excuse anything, but it explains everything, and the refusal to hold both of those things simultaneously, the refusal to see the human being inside the transformation, is where so much of the public conversation about Michael Jackson has always failed. Because it is easier to make him a symbol. Easier to make him a cautionary tale or a mystery or a controversy, than to do the harder, more uncomfortable work of actually seeing him. Actually reckoning with what the world did to a child who had the misfortune of being born with a gift so large that the world immediately decided it belonged to everyone except him. The bad era arrived in 1987 and brought with it a new dimension of pressure. Because following Thriller was not a creative challenge, it was a psychological one. The question was never whether Michael could make great music. The question was whether greatness that couldn't match the unrepeatable phenomenon of Thriller would be perceived as failure. And in certain corners of the media, it was. Bad sold 35 million copies. In any other context, for any other artist, that number represents the pinnacle of a career. For Michael Jackson in 1987, it was framed as a disappointment. Because the bar Thriller had set was not a bar. It was a ceiling that had been placed above the atmosphere. And the cruelty of that framing, the casual, reflexive diminishment of extraordinary achievement because it didn't exceed the most extraordinary achievement in recording history, was something Michael absorbed. And something that quietly, steadily, contributed to the pressure building inside him. The Dangerous album in 1991 marked another shift. A deliberate, conscious artistic evolution away from the polished pop perfection of the Thriller and Bad eras towards something rawer. Something more politically engaged. Songs like Black or White addressed race in America with a directness that was new for Michael. Heal the World positioned him explicitly as a humanitarian, a role he had always played privately but was now claiming publicly. And Will You Be There, with its orchestral grandeur and its lyric that sounded less like a pop song and more like a prayer from someone who genuinely wasn't sure the answer was yes, revealed something about where Michael Jackson was emotionally in 1991 that no interview ever quite captured. He was asking the world a question, and he wasn't confident about the answer. And then 1993 arrived, and everything changed. The accusation from Jordan Chandler didn't just damage Michael Jackson's reputation. It restructured his entire relationship with the world. Because up until that moment, whatever controversies had swirled around him, whatever questions had been asked about his appearance or his lifestyle or his relationships, there had always been a foundational public affection that survived everything. People might have found him strange, but they loved him. And love, for Michael Jackson, was not an abstract concept. It was oxygen. It was the thing that made the performing bearable. The thing that justified every sacrifice, every night of missed sleep, every moment of physical pain pushed through for the sake of the show. And now that love, that foundational, global love, had a crack in it. A crack that certain people, with certain interests, would spend years trying to widen. The Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Department investigation was exhaustive, humiliating, invasive in ways that were specifically designed, whether intentionally or not, to maximize psychological damage. Michael was strip-searched, photographed, asked to describe intimate details of his own body for purposes of comparison with descriptions provided by his accuser. And through all of it, through the entire ordeal, He maintained a composure in public that concealed what people close to him described as a complete internal collapse. He was not sleeping. He was barely eating. The prescription medication use that had begun after the Pepsi burn accident increased sharply. And the man who had once seemed almost supernaturally capable of enduring pressure, was beginning, for the first time, to show genuine signs of fracture. The 1993 MTV Video Music Awards performance of Black or White and Billie Jean, delivered in the middle of the investigation, is one of the most extraordinary things ever committed to television. Because Michael Jackson, under criminal investigation, publicly accused of the worst thing a person can be accused of, walked onto that stage and performed with a focus and a ferocity that left everyone watching simultaneously in awe and deeply unsettled. Because how does a person do that? How does a human being carry that weight and still move like that? Still command a stage like that? The answer is that for Michael Jackson, the stage was the only place where none of it existed. The only place where the accusations and the investigations and the fear and the grief and the loneliness temporarily stopped being real. The stage was the only home he had ever fully trusted, and he retreated to it, the way other people retreat to the only safe place they know. The settlement in 1994 closed one chapter and opened another that was darker and harder to read. Because the narrative had now been established in the public mind in a way that no legal outcome could fully dislodge. And Michael knew it, the people around him knew it, and the knowledge of it, the understanding that a portion of the world had made a permanent decision about who he was, altered something in him that was visible to anyone paying close attention. He became more guarded, more isolated, more dependent on the small circle of people he allowed close. And that small circle was not always populated by people whose primary concern was Michael's well-being. It was sometimes populated by people whose primary concern was proximity to Michael's power. And the difference between those two things would cost him dearly. The marriage to Lisa Marie Presley in May 1994 surprised everyone, including, reportedly, some of Michael's closest friends. Lisa Marie was the daughter of Elvis Presley, the only other artist in history who came close to occupying the cultural space Michael occupied, and the symbolism of the union was almost too neat to be accidental. Two children of impossible fame. Two people who had grown up inside the machine and survived it, at significant personal cost, and emerged as something that the ordinary categories of celebrity couldn't quite contain. Their relationship was real in ways that its critics never fully credited. Lisa Marie has spoken in subsequent years about genuinely loving Michael, about seeing him clearly in a way that most people around him were either unwilling or unable to do. About warning him, about the people she felt were dangerous to him, about watching him make choices she couldn't stop and couldn't understand and couldn't forgive herself for not preventing. The divorce in 1996 was another fracture. Another piece of the connective tissue between Michael and the world of ordinary human relationship, quietly severed. And what followed it, the marriage to Debbie Rowe, the births of Prince and Paris, the increasingly elaborate measures taken to protect his children from the world that had never protected him, revealed a man trying, with everything he had left, to create something better. To break the cycle, to give his children the thing he had never had. Not money, not fame, not opportunity, just safety, just the uncomplicated experience of being loved without an audience. Just the ordinary miracle of a childhood that belonged to them. But the world was not finished with Michael Jackson. The 2003 Martin Bashir documentary reopened wounds that had barely closed. And the subsequent arrest, the subsequent trial, the subsequent 2005 verdict of not guilty on all counts, unfolded against a backdrop of physical and psychological deterioration that people in the courtroom described in terms that were genuinely alarming. Michael was not the man who had headlined the Dangerous World Tour. He was not the man who had sold out Wembley Stadium 7 nights in a row. He was a man who appeared, to those watching closely, to be running on something other than ordinary human reserves. On will, on stubbornness, on some deep, irrational, unkillable refusal to be destroyed by the people and the forces that were trying to destroy him. The acquittal in June 2005 should have been a moment of relief. And perhaps for a few hours, it was. But relief, for someone carrying Michael Jackson's history, could only ever be temporary. Because the architecture of his life by that point, the financial entanglements, the medication dependency, the isolation, the exhaustion, the accumulated weight of 5 decades of extraordinary pressure, was not something that a courtroom verdict could repair. He left America, took his children and left. And the years that followed, the quiet years in Bahrain and Ireland and Las Vegas, were described by those who saw him during that period as the years of a man trying to remember who he was when no one was watching. Trying to find, somewhere in the rubble of everything that had happened, the version of himself that had existed before the world got its hands on him. The This Is It rehearsals in 2009 were supposed to be the return. The resurrection, the moment Michael Jackson reminded the world, and perhaps himself, what he was capable of. And in glimpses, in moments captured in the rehearsal footage released after his death, you can see it. The dancer was still there. The musician was still there. The man who could communicate something through movement and music that no one else could reach, was still there. But the body that housed all of it, the body that had been burned and medicated and pushed and starved and altered and exhausted across 5 decades of performance, was not keeping pace with the vision. And the people responsible for ensuring that the gap between Michael's vision and his body's capacity was managed safely, were not doing their jobs. Or were doing other jobs instead. June 25, 2009 is a date that exists in the memory of almost everyone alive to experience it the way certain dates do. The way certain moments do. The moment the radio announcement arrives and something in the air shifts permanently. Michael Jackson was gone, and the world, which had spent the previous decade arguing about who he was and what he had done, suddenly fell into something that resembled, imperfectly and briefly, silence. Not the silence of resolution. Not the silence of answered questions. But the silence of something irreplaceable disappearing. The silence of realizing, too late, that whatever else was true, whatever arguments remained unresolved, the thing that had made him impossible to ignore was also the thing that made him impossible to replace. And it was gone. And it was not coming back. What changed Michael Jackson? The honest answer is that the world changed him. Piece by piece. Year by year, decision by decision, some his, some made by others without his knowledge or consent. The childhood that was consumed changed him. The father who turned love into a performance standard changed him. The industry that packaged him before he could package himself changed him. The accusations changed him. The trials changed him. The medications changed him. The isolation changed him. The love of his children changed him. The music, always the music, changed him and saved him and was the only constant in a life where almost nothing else held still long enough to hold on to. But here is the thing that nobody wants to sit with. The thing that makes the story of Michael Jackson genuinely tragic rather than simply complicated. He knew what was happening to him. He saw it. He felt it. In interviews across the decades, in songs that said things too directly to be accidental, in the eyes of a man who spent 40 years performing for a world that claimed to love him while simultaneously refusing to let him be human, there is evidence of a person who understood his own situation with painful clarity. Who knew the machine was eating him. Who kept feeding it anyway. Because the alternative was silence. And silence, for Michael Jackson, was the one thing that had always been more frightening than anything the spotlight could do. The untold story that changed Michael Jackson forever is not one story. It is 1,000 small ones. A father's voice in a rehearsal room. A burn on a scalp that was never supposed to happen. A settlement that was never supposed to be necessary. A documentary that was never supposed to be weaponized. A doctor who was never supposed to be the last person a legend trusted with his life.